So I'm just going to start with my introduction. I am Karen Butler. I go by Kate, just to be confusing. Assistant curator at the Kemper Art Museum here at Washington University, and also curator of the Georges Braque exhibition on view at the museum. First, I have to thank you all for coming to the talk on this snowy winter evening. I'm very pleased that you all made the effort to come, despite the weather, to hear our distinguished speaker this evening, conservator Patricia Favero. Tonight, Patty will present a talk titled Investigating Material and Process in Georges Braque's Still Life Paintings, 1928 to 1944. This talk is offered as a way of delving further into some of the larger questions of the exhibition. For Braque, still life was the source of a lifelong investigation into the nature of human perception and the experience of the lived body in the world. It was still life, he said, with its focus on objects within reach of the hand that best allowed him to address the relationship between humans and the objects that make up everyday life. The exhibition explores this relationship and its connections to Braque's artistic process, as well as to his long-standing interest in rendering the material quality of objects. We know, for example, that Braque systematically worked through groups of related paintings, revising them for years on end or putting them aside and returning to them later. This resulted in cycles of works, some ranging across an entire decade, that explore variations of the same motif, in which he employed experimental techniques and materials to evoke the real yet elusive relationships between humans and things. Many of these cycles are gathered together in the exhibition, some exhibited together for the first time since the 1930s. To gain a better understanding of the relationship between Braque's materials and processes, what Braque saw as the tactile, tangible quality of things, Patty worked with two conservation specialists from Harvard, and you may talk about them, Aaron Mysak and Narayan Kandinsky, in examining 21 paintings dating between 1928 and 1944. The results of their study were published in a beautifully illustrated and written, I might add, essay in the exhibition catalog. Patty's work and the work of her collaborators offers new insight into the artist's profound interest in the painting process and the possibilities of Braque's materials as he sought to expand the experience of pictorial space, making it something entirely human. I should also say that her work could not have been completed without the aid of conservators at all of the participating institutions throughout the US and Europe that lent works to the show. Some that didn't, and we saw their works anyway. And I see in the audience one of those conservators, Paul Hayner, who aided us by x-raying one of the Braques at the St. Louis Art Museum. It was an act which proved invaluable to our understanding of Braque's process, and one which I assume you will learn more about this evening. And Paul, thank you very much for doing that for us. It's one of my favorite things of the many things in the show. A bit about Patty now. Patty is associate conservator at the Phillips Collection. She specializes in the conservation of paintings and the study of the materials and methods of modern painters. At the Phillips, she has carried out technical studies on works by Pablo Picasso, Paul Klee, and Henri Rousseau, and has assisted with the study of works by Edgar, Degas, and Wassily Kandinsky. She graduated from Buffalo State College in 2002 with a Master of Arts and a Certificate of Advanced Study in Art Conservation. She completed postgraduate internships at the Cincinnati Art Museum and the Tate Gallery in London before joining the Phillips as an advanced fellow in 2004. I'm almost done, but I have to say that this project is one that is very dear to my heart and one that I'm particularly pleased to have been a part of. In general, scholarship has focused on Braque's work of the 19 teens, the period of his close collaboration with Pablo Picasso when they invented Cubism. And there's been very little scholarship on Braque's later work and no conservation studies at all of the later work. So Patty's work is really the first of its kind, and hopefully it will spark continued interest in these paintings, which are incredibly complex, not only spatially but materially. I'm very proud to be able to bring her here to Washington University and to have her share her work with all of you. One last thing before turning the podium over to Patty, I'll just remind you we're having a conservation workshop tomorrow in the galleries from 10 to 12. It was designed for WashU faculty, staff, students, and members of the museum, but we have a few spots open if any of you would like to come. Allison Taylor is here. She's in the back with the short blonde hair. And she's welcome to, can register with Allison and come to the workshop. We'll be doing some, interesting things with the microscope and taking a painting off the wall, looking at it unframed, and talking about some of the findings more in depth. And we have just produced this wonderful conservation brochure, which is available in the galleries. Allison has a few if you want one on the way out. And now, without further ado, Patty, it's all yours.
Lovely introduction. Can everybody hear me?
Nope.
Okay.
Closer to the mic.
Okay. I can't. I have a little belly, so I can't get that close. But hopefully I'll get louder as I get into it. So, Kate, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I think I might reiterate some of the things that you said in the introduction, which is hopefully fine. I'd also like to just thank the Kemper for their support of this project and for inviting me here tonight. Excuse me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you the findings from our recent conservation technical study of Braque's mid-career paintings. Many of the paintings we studied are, of course, featured in the exhibition that's currently on view here at Kemper. So as Kate mentioned, the technical study was undertaken in collaboration with conservation scientists at Harvard Art Museum's Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies, the two scientists, Aaron Mysak and Narayan Kandikar. And also, as Kate mentioned, but I don't think it can be said enough, the study would not have been possible without the assistance from curators, conservators, and scientists at a number of the institutions that have also lent works to the exhibition. These colleagues generously gave me access to examine their paintings in person, and in some cases, as in the case of Paul Hayner, carried out and shared results of their own analysis that we were able to incorporate into the overall study. So I think I'll begin with a walkthrough of what it is that we did. And I apologize if some of this is a little elementary. Braque himself implied that some insight into his paintings might be found in considering how they were made. And as you see on the screen, he said, "The viewer retraces the same path as the artist, and as it is the path that counts more than the thing, one is more interested by the journey." This is, in essence, the purpose of a technical study, to learn more about an artist through direct study of his work and through a better understanding of his process and his choice of materials. A technical study asks, what materials did the artist use? What were his methods, or how did he use those materials? And finally, what is the significance of the information for a greater understanding of the artist and his work? Since our study was the first to our knowledge to look at Braque's mid-career paintings, we wanted to learn as much as possible about his materials and methods during this period and in each step of the painting process, from preparing the canvas to applying the finishing touches. We also hoped to better understand the significance of material and process to Braque's work, especially during this period of his career. For our study, we looked at 21 paintings dating between 1928 and 1944. We used a variety of examination and analytical techniques, beginning, as with most any technical study, with careful visual inspection in good lighting. And for scientific emphasis, I've included a diagram of the electromagnetic spectrum in this slide. The region of visible light is highlighted here. The electromagnetic spectrum also includes ultraviolet and infrared, gamma rays, X-rays, microwaves, and radio waves, a few of which we also use to examine artwork. With the naked eye, we examined paintings in normal light, which is just even overall lighting as you might expect. In raking light, a strong lighting from one direction that just grazes the surface, the texture and topography of the paint are highlighted. Specular light is a form of raking light viewed at an angle that highlights surface characteristics such as matte and shiny areas, in addition to texture and topography. A closer look with the aid of a magnifying glass or a stereo microscope reveals characteristics of the paint not visible to the naked eye. And you can see in the examples illustrated here a variety of surface features such as cracking, wrinkling, and pitting of the paint. Just outside of the visible range is the ultraviolet range of the electromagnetic spectrum. Ultraviolet wavelengths to the left of the visible light on the diagram are just higher in energy than blue and violet in visible light. You probably know that prolonged exposure to these higher energy ultraviolet rays in sunlight can be damaging to your skin. UV is also damaging to most artwork, and in general we try to limit exposure. But you probably also know that certain materials glow under black light, which is just ultraviolet radiation with most of the visible light filtered out. Using ultraviolet to examine artworks is similar in concept. When exposed to low energy UVA radiation in an otherwise dark room, certain materials glow or fluoresce with characteristic color and intensity. This UVA-induced visible fluorescence, as it's called, can aid in the identification of materials such as natural resins, and which are usually varnishes, certain adhesives, and some pigments. A few techniques allow one to see beneath the surface of a painting. Used in our study, these techniques reveal additional clues about Braque's materials and methods. In the visible range of the spectrum, transmitted light, or light shined through the front or reverse of the canvas, can offer clues to the relative thickness of paint layers and sometimes reveal artist changes. Infrared, to the right of the visible light on the diagram, is just lower in energy than the red portion of the visible light. Night vision goggles and cameras used in nature specials to record nighttime animal activity, for example, are sensitive to light in the infrared region of the electromagnetic spectrum. Excuse me. Conservators use similar technology for infrared imaging. Many pigments are transparent or semi-transparent under infrared. Others either reflect or absorb the energy, appearing white or dark respectively in a black and white infrared image. Infrared imaging can be used to detect preliminary drawings or changes made beneath the surface paint layers. And reflectography here just refers to imaging using reflected light. Transmitted light infrared is also an effective examination technique. X-rays began to be used in the study of art around the mid-20th century. Relatively recent advances in technology allow conservators and conservation scientists to safely harness X-ray energy for both imaging and non-destructive chemical analysis. This is your first look at the St. Louis Art Museum X-ray. It's our example for X-radiography, or X-ray imaging, where relatively low energy X-rays, similar to those used by doctors, are passed through a painting onto X-ray sensitive film or plates. X-radiography records the relative densities of paint materials. X-rays pass easily through thinner or less dense areas, and so appear darker in the X-radiograph. Thicker areas and areas of greater density appear white. Like infrared imaging, X-radiography can reveal changes that may have occurred at different stages of the painting's development. In addition to in-depth examination of an artwork using the techniques already described, materials analysis is essential to a comprehensive technical study. And this is where our scientists, both Narayan and Aaron, and the generous support of other scientists in our field came in, were very important. X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, or XRF, is one recent advance in X-ray technology that allows for the identification of paint materials, specifically pigments, without the need to take a sample. In the slide, you see a portable XRF instrument attached to a tripod. It is about, I think it's about 5 millimeters away from the paint surface. In XRF, a focused X-ray beam, no larger than 5 millimeters, and higher in energy than X-rays used for radiography, excites a characteristic fluorescence in an area of the artwork. This invisible fluorescence can be measured. Software generates a chart like the one you see on the right, where the peaks identify the presence of specific chemical elements in the sample. Pigments are inferred based on the elements detected, the colors of the area examined, and what is already known about the artwork. In our study, XRF analysis of 8 paintings provided a general impression of Braque's color choices and the evolution of his palette over the period of the study. Finally, microscopic paint samples carefully taken from the edges or other areas of previous paint loss can provide an enormous amount of material information. For our study, we collected and analyzed paint samples from 4 works at the Phillips Collection, 2 works from the late 1920s, Lemons and Napkin Ring and Round Table, which you'll see a lot of, and 2 from 1944, the washstand and pewter pot with a plate of fruit, which you'll also see a lot of. Pigment dispersions, which you see on the left, are minute paint scrapings dispersed on a microscope slide, and are analyzed usually with polarized light microscopy. At 50 times, 100 times, or even 400 times magnification, pigments can be identified based on morphology, color, and how light is refracted as it passes through the particles. Analysis of paint cross-sections, tiny chips of paint that ideally include all of the paint layers present, reveals information about the structure of the paint layers, including physical inclusions and binding media, and can give some insight into the artist's working methods as well as his materials. Additional chemical and molecular analysis of paint samples with scanning electron microscopy, Raman spectroscopy, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, and Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, just to name a few of the techniques that were used for our study, can give concrete, detailed pigment identification and identify the paint binding media. As I discuss the results of our Braque study, I'll refer to these techniques and hopefully clarify how they were useful in our research. In looking at Braque's paintings, one observes not just sand in some pictures, but a variety of intricate and layered textures, along with more subtle variations in the paint surface and often visible evidence of reworking. These observations demonstrate not only Braque's affinity for his materials, but also suggest a profound interest in the process, not just in the end result, but a consciousness of the making of the picture and the greater possibilities of his painting materials. Throughout his career, Braque sought to redefine the experience of pictorial space, to expand it to include an implied tactile or manual component, in addition to the more conventional visual or illusionistic elements of painting. Braque mostly used traditional materials of oil painting, but often manipulated them in experimental ways to emphasize their materiality. In each element of the painting process, we see evidence of Braque's experimental nature in his choice of format and painting support, in the preparation of his supports, his deliberate color choices, his handling of the paint and modification of the oil medium, and his frequent reworking of his compositions. Each element affects the whole, and so I'll consider each of these elements separately as I discuss Braque's materials and process. All the paintings examined in our study were painted on fine or medium weight linen stretched over a wooden framework, either a keyed stretcher or a strainer, both of which Braque used. Keyed stretchers, the detail is seen on the slide on the right, can be expanded at the corners to adjust the tension of the canvas. This is done by tapping on the wooden keys inserted into the corner joint. The detail on the left shows a corner of a strainer. Strainers have fixed joints and cannot be adjusted. Even though canvases pre-stretched onto stretchers or strainers could be purchased from color merchants, it appears Braque preferred to stretch his own canvases between 1928 and 1944. Irregular Edges suggest that Braque used scissors to cut his canvas from rolls, and pencil guidelines, still visible at some canvas edges, probably indicated where to make the cut. There is one faint line along the top of the edge of the canvas on the left and along the right edge of the canvas in the picture on the right. And I think in this picture it's a little more visible along the right edge of the canvas as well. It does appear that Braque bought pre-assembled stretchers and strainers from color merchants. This page from a 1925 color merchant's catalog advertises chassis nus, or bare frameworks, which were available in a variety of standard sizes and in 3 different formats: figure, or portrait, paysage, or landscape, and marine, seascape. Dimensions for many of Braque's paintings at this time correspond to these standard sizes. The round table seen on the left matches the dimensions of an 80F or figure stretcher. Still life with guitar and red curtains in the upper right, and flute glass and mandolin at the lower right match a size 40 figure stretcher, but both have been rotated to accommodate the still life format. Braque also purchased stretchers hors mesure, or literally outside of the standard measure. Roughly half of the paintings studied in our study fall into this category. Particularly common is the long, narrow format, such as the exaggerated horizontal format of the paintings from the Rosenberg Quartet. And for many of his Géridon table pictures, Braque favored a narrow vertical format, such as this Géridon from 1935 on the left, and the red table begun in 1939, shown in the middle. The washstand from 1944 is similarly tall and narrow, but smaller in scale. Large interior with palette, dated 1942, seems a rare do-it-yourself project even for Braque. For this painting, Braque customized the size of the canvas and stretcher himself. According to an old conservation report, Braque built out the original stretcher, quote, crudely with 11.5-inch extensions to support what he wanted to paint, end quote. He then enlarged a piece of fine, commercially primed canvas by sewing a 4-inch strip of unprimed medium weight linen along the bottom. The position of the seam is approximated by the red line. The difference in the two canvases is subtle and almost invisible, even at the edge where both are exposed. This is the tacking edge of the picture. The arrow points to an approximate junction between the two canvases, and maybe you can see a slight difference in the roughness of the weave, or the size of the weave. The seam is barely visible in the thick paint layers. There are hints of it along the top of Braque's signature and in other areas along the bottom of the picture. And again, the red line approximates where the seam is. Perhaps at the height of the German occupation of Paris, the desired materials weren't available, or Braque simply realized the large canvas he had on hand would not be sufficient for the composition, and so he just improvised. So once the canvas is stretched, it is typically sized with an animal glue, and then a first overall paint layer called the ground is applied to prepare the canvas for painting. Braque said, "I prepare the ground of my canvases with the utmost care, for it is the ground that supports the entire picture, like the foundation of a house." And the ground significantly influences not just the overall durability of a painting, but its final appearance as well. Braque often incorporated the ground into a composition as part of a background pattern or left it exposed in spaces between objects. He rarely painted over the ground completely. Like many artists of his time, Braque painted on canvas prepared commercially with thin, uniform white grounds that he purchased from color merchants. Just as often, however, he prepared his own canvases, using his knowledge of materials to experiment with colored and textured grounds that in the end played significant roles in the finished pictures. Of the pictures examined for this study, about half were prepared with an artist-applied ground. Two types in particular were characteristic of this period: flat grounds and highly textured white grounds, recalling fresco or stucco surfaces. In both types of grounds, Braque consistently mixed sand and even small gravel into the paint to create overall texture, a foundation for his tactile space. He mixed the sand into the paint before applying it to the canvas, and also sprinkled it on top of fresh paint, pressing again to make it stick. Braque began preparing canvases with black grounds as early as 1918 and continued using them through the 1920s. The dark grounds added depth and atmosphere to his compositions. At the same time, the usually matte, unsaturated black paint highlighted the flatness of the picture plane. Fine grains of sand in the ground emphasized the materiality of the surface even more. In this painting, the napkin ring, the ground serves as the base color for the blue and green veins of the marbled background and as the color of the table, which is otherwise defined only by an outline of yellow paint. Braque used black grounds less frequently in the 1930s as he experimented with a more colorful palette, but returned to them in the 1940s. The washstand and pewter pot and plate of fruit, both dated 1944, are examples of later works where Braque again began to use black grounds. In the paintings, the grounds are characteristically matte, textured with sand, and visible throughout the composition. Despite these similarities, however, analysis of paint samples from both pictures found that Braque took a uniquely different approach to the preparation of each canvas. Microscopic and SEM analysis of a cross-section taken from the upper right edge of the washstand found the canvas was prepared with 2 layers of black paint. The first layer, layer 1, is made up of bone black found in a water-soluble medium. This layer seems to have been applied as a colored sizing to prepare the canvas for a second layer of black paint. Layer 2, also bone black, is bound in oil with the addition of a natural resin, which Braque may have added to thin the paint and to hasten drying. When viewed through the stereo microscope, we see a smooth and cohesive paint surface characteristic of well-bound paint. By comparison, the black ground of pewter pot and plate of fruit, viewed through the stereo microscope, appears dry and thinner, with the tops of the canvas threads peeking through and small voids throughout the paint layer. Braque prepared this canvas with just one thin layer of black paint. The paint cross-section shows the thinness of the ground, which is layer 1, the black layer, especially around the quartz particle. Although the tip of the quartz sand inclusion peeks out, the particle appears to be generally surrounded by a thin layer of black, suggesting the sand was first mixed into the black paint before application to help the sand better adhere to the canvas. This black paint was found to be an entirely different mixture than in the washstand, consisting of very fine particles of lamp black, a pigment made from soot, and iron oxides. A fair amount of the colorless clay filler, kaolin, was also mixed into the ground, which can create particularly matte and somewhat absorbent surfaces, consistent with what was observed through the stereo microscope, and very different from the cohesive ground of the washstand. Moving on to Fresco Grounds. At the end of 1927, shortly after moving into his new Paris studio, Braque began experimenting with a new type of artist-supplied ground, highly textured, white, and evoking stucco or fresco walls that he would continue to use throughout the 1930s. And the round table from 1929 is one of the first examples of this type of Braque's use of this type of ground. Here we see the painting in raking light, which emphasizes the texture of the paint. In this case, the texture is purely from the ground layer. In the round table, the ground was found to be a mixture of lead white, bulked with calcite, dolomite, some kaolin, and slightly larger particles of powdered quartz, which give a fine, gritty texture to the paint. Into this paint, Braque mixed sand and fine gravel of varied shapes and sizes to add the more overt texture. Here again, the sand particle in the cross-section is almost completely surrounded by the ground. Braque's method of paint application also contributed to the unique texture of these pictures. He applied the chunky paint thinly, possibly first using a large palette knife or even a small trowel. Paint topography suggests that he then spread the paint with a stiff brush, being careful not to thin it too much, but rather to maintain a certain body and texture in the paint. Up close in the on both details, we see haphazard linear grooves made by particles of sand and gravel caught and dragged by the brush. Multiple levels of texture created with the impasto of the brush strokes, the coarse sand and gravel inclusions, and the fine quartz mixed into the paint. Braque also added still more sand on top of the ground, tamping loose grains into the still wet paint with the brush. Of the paintings we examined, sand and other inclusions were almost exclusively limited to the ground layers, either mixed in with the paint or applied on the surface. It appears that Braque generally reserved such inclusions to establish an overall textural tone, and he often painted thinly over these grounds to retain the overall effect in the finished picture. The attention that we see in Braque's preparation of his foundations of his pictures, along with their variety, suggests that he considered each painting literally from the ground up. We begin to see both the deliberate approach and the experimental nature that we will see in the rest of Braque's painting process. The next step of the process for Braque was to roughly sketch out the composition on the prepared canvas. For inspiration, he turned to sketchbooks he kept to record ideas. He said, "My sketchbook serves my purpose, like a cookbook when you're hungry. I open the book, and any odd sketch offers me material for work." But Braque did not copy the sketches. Rather, once inspired, he sketched directly onto the prepared canvas in pencil, charcoal, or in the case of black grounds, chalk. And I just wanted to emphasize with this blow-up from the Paul Strand photograph, with the chalk and the vine charcoal among the other materials on Braque's studio table. And as an aside, the H on the bottle behind the chalk probably stands for wheel or oil in French. Preliminary drawings organized space on the canvas and loosely defined the forms of the objects. Occasionally, Braque left a sketch partially visible, as in Still Life with Oysters seen on the left, where faint charcoal outlines of the loaf of bread can be seen beneath the form of the bottle. In Lemons and Napkin Ring, both charcoal and fine pencil lines define the contours of the tablecloth and the lemons, seen on the right. Multiple lines around the napkin in the center suggest some indecision on Braque's part about the size and placement of this particular element during the early stages of the painting. And you can see some of these lines, particularly at the right of the napkin and just around the top of the napkin ring. Braque also used pencil, chalk, and charcoal during the painting process, sketching new elements as he developed a composition. This image from Braque's Paris studio in 1944 shows the washstand yet to be finished, with shapes sketched in chalk near the lower right, where the radiator will be. On some pictures, a viewer might see evidence, a rubbed chalk or charcoal line, where Braque drew in a new element on top of the paint, but then decided against it and rubbed it out. Braque's color choices demonstrate an interest in versatility in material contrasts. Earth pigments, brown umbers and iron oxides, along with bone and carbon black, and a variety of whites, lead white, zinc white, and later lithocone, formed the foundation of his palette. In the late 1920s, Braque began to work with bright, pure colors, with which he continued to experiment throughout the 1930s. Pigment analysis of the 8 paintings in the study using X-ray fluorescence found enough similarities to suggest Braque's palette remained largely consistent even as his style evolved and he shifted to using more muted tones during the war. The round table, seen on the left in detail, was one of Braque's earliest paintings of this period to feature washes of bright, pure color against a foundation of earth browns, white, and black. In general, he favored traditional and relatively stable pigments. Here he used vermilion red, emerald green, ultramarine blue, and for the yellow, a mixture of zinc white and possibly Hansa yellow, a stable organic yellow lake pigment found in some of his other pictures. The palette of the washstand is similar to that of the round table, but here the colors are mixed with earth pigments, resulting in muted tones. The salmon color in the upper left is a mixture of vermilion and yellow ochre, and the window frame is again emerald green, but in a thicker application and mixed with an earth pigment as well. We commonly think of contrasting colors as those directly across from each other on the color wheel, such as red and green, yellow and purple, orange and blue. And we know that juxtaposing contrasting colors creates strong visual vibrations at their intersection. Braque was interested in more subtle contrasts, juxtaposing different hues, in more subtle contrasts, juxtaposing different hues, different reds in Braque's example, with contrasting properties such as warm versus cool or opaque versus translucent. In this painting, Still Life with Pink Fish, Braque demonstrates his example using different greens instead of reds. XRF analysis revealed he painted the tablecloth with a chromium oxide green, a strongly opaque color with a cool bluish tone, and contrasted that with emerald green, which is a relatively warm and transparent pigment, which he used here for the background pattern. In Pewter Pot and Plate of Fruit, Braque contrasted the warmth of the vermilion used in the fiery red passages in the background with a cool pink paint used for the tablecloth in the foreground. Analysis revealed the pink paint is a mixture of an organic red lake pigment and lithocone, a relatively transparent white pigment. Organic lakes are often attractive to artists because they are brightly colored and transparent. However, they are historically very sensitive to light and frequently fade over time. Analysis also revealed that the lake pigment in Pewter Pot was not of the best quality, compounding the already inherent instability. Rather than a typical colorless substrate such as aluminum sulfate, barium sulfate, or chalk, the substrate for this red lake was found to be starch, which was known to have been used in lower quality paints in the 19th century. That Braque would select this color and use it so prominently was surprising considering his other more stable color choices. He may not have been aware at the time of the poor quality of the paint. Light exposure has since caused the red lake pigment to fade. You can see in the cross-section the color remains deeper in the top layer, layer 2, but is all but faded from the surface of the paint. We would not have any sense of the original color had the frame not protected the bottom edge of the painting from the damaging effects of light exposure, leaving a half-inch line of unfaded pink along the bottom. At this point, the damage has been done and cannot be reversed. The tablecloth now appears off-white, and I would like to note here that when the painting came into the Phillips Collection, it was already faded. And we didn't do it. No. But it was relatively recently. But only with this study did we discover the originally intended appearance of the picture. So moving on to paint and surface, this is the really interesting part of Braque's paintings. Well, one, I guess. Braque's expertise in combining, layering, and manipulating material was central to the construction of his pictures. The feel of the paint was every bit as important as the color. As mentioned before, it appears that Braque did not add sand to manipulate texture in his paint layers. Rather, he achieved texture in a variety of other ways by manipulating the paint on the canvas and modifying his paint medium. He used a variety of tools and techniques and often juxtaposed contrasting textures within a single area of a composition. For instance, to create the marble pattern in the right of the picture of lemons and napkin ring, Braque first used a brush and possibly a sponge to stipple brown and white paint over an ochre base color. He then lightly dragged a broad stroke of white through still wet underlying paint, mixing the colors on the canvas to describe the veining in the marble. As a contrast to this more luxurious material, Braque created a simple pattern of haphazard brushstrokes in the thin gray paint to the left. In some compositions, selective applications of thick impasto add an almost sculptural quality, as in the table leg near the bottom of large interior with palette. In Still Life with palette on the right, cords of blue and yellow paint applied that appear to be applied directly from the tube enhance the relatively smooth white background. Braque also continued to use textural manipulation techniques from his earlier Cubist years. In Still Life with palette, he dragged a greening comb through brown paint to suggest the texture of the wood on the palette, whereas in the round table, he indicated the wood grain not with the comb, but by scoring the paint with a 3 or 4 pronged tool, perhaps one similar to those used by sculptors for modeling clay or plaster. Braque's paint surfaces characteristically have a variety of textures and sheen rather than an overall uniform finish. He often achieved specific effects by modifying his oil paint medium to adjust consistency, opacity, and gloss in his paint. In contrasting matte, gloss, opacity, and translucency, Braque explored new ways to influence the perception of space and color in his compositions. In Lemons and Napkin Rain, for instance, Braque used contrasts in paint texture and consistency to affect the perception of space between the brown pitcher and the brown table. The brown paint of the pitcher has a matte, opaque, and stiff quality, which Braque likely achieved by blotting excess oil from the paint. By contrast, to create the smooth, translucent, and slightly glossy effect of the brown tabletop, Braque added varnish to thin the paint, making it more fluid and transparent. Seen in ultraviolet, a slight fluorescence in the tabletop paint next to the zero fluorescence in the paint of the pitcher supports the idea of the presence of different media in the two areas. The contrasting textures created by these modifications in the brown paint cause the viewer to perceive the matte brown pitcher in the foreground of the composition, while the diluted brown table remains in the background. Now we return again to the washstand and the pewter pot, whose black grounds were found to be so different, although they initially appeared similar. In the paint layers, we instead found areas of green paint which, although they initially appeared very different, in fact started out as the same paint. Samples of light green paint from the pewter pot and the washstand were analyzed and both found to be mixtures of Prussian blue and Hansa yellow, bound in oil. A virtually identical mixture of white pigments and colorless extenders, also found in the two samples, seemed to indicate that this was the same paint taken from the same tube or tin. However, the very different appearance of the paint in the two pictures suggests Braque must have modified the mixture specifically for each painting. In pewter pot, the green paint is particularly matte and opaque, mixed with just enough oil medium to bind the pigments together. The small circular depressions that you see in the paint surface are remnants of air bubbles from the wet paint, possibly created by Braque vigorously mixing the paint before he brushed it onto the canvas. In the washstand, this same green paint is translucent with a satin gloss finish, achieved by mixing not only varnish into the paint, but also beeswax. The wax was most likely added as a paste, dissolved in turpentine, and would also have given the paint smooth handling properties in addition to the satin finish. Reworking was an intrinsic part of Braque's painting process, and it was common for him, as it is with many artists, to make changes to compositions in the course of painting. He frequently had a number of paintings in process at any one time. If he came to an impasse with one painting, he would set it aside to revisit later and work on another. The variety of reworking seen in Braque's paintings reveals a painter as spontaneous and intuitive in his process as he was methodical and deliberate in his choice of materials. He often incorporated elements of earlier compositions into finished pictures or left evidence of his changes visible to the naked eye, adding to add dimension to the finished work and allowing the viewer to witness his painting process. In Pictured Candlestick and Black Fish, where yellow and blue stand out against surrounding earth tones, passage of acid green and magenta from an earlier composition remains visible in the background. Looking at the painting with infrared reflectography, we find that these passages are part of a larger chain pattern. This pattern shows up in other works by Braque, painted in the mid-1930s, suggesting that this canvas potentially lingered in Braque's studio a number of years before he went back to work on it. In Still Life with a Fruit Dish, Braque painted the patterned black tablecloth over an earlier design using thin, transparent black paint and seemingly intentionally leaving the earlier pattern still visible. In doing so, the artist created the appearance of layered fabric, along with a sense of spatial ambiguity in the final picture. In the lower right, the image shows the painting in specular light. Viewed from, viewed from this angle, the underlying pattern becomes more evident due to differences in surface gloss, and we can begin to make out a resemblance to the grape and leaf pattern decorating the background of this picture. Some changes, known as pentimenti, start out hidden beneath the surface but reveal themselves over time as oil paint becomes more transparent. For example, this detail of the crystal vase shows that Braque added the glass after painting the dark gray background and piping of the tablecloth, rather than reserving a space for it, suggesting that the glass was a later addition to the composition, not part of its original vision. An X-radiography of still life with palette revealed a different still life composition, almost completely obscured beneath the current painting. An egg and dart pattern decorates the table edge along the bottom of the canvas. A pipe and a kidney-shaped dish can be seen in the left hand of the composition. And a group of circles at the right suggests a bunch of grapes. The lack of details around the outside edges in the X-radiograph are due to the fact that the X-rays cannot penetrate the dense lead-white paint Braque used for the background on the overlying painting. Even here, however, a clue to the presence of the underlying picture may be found in the center of the palette, where Braque has left a few of the underlying grapes partially exposed. Occasionally, Braque would more drastically recycle a painting by removing the canvas from the stretcher and using the other side for a new painting. For Still Life with Pink Fish, he used a fragment of an unfinished picture, which he restretched with the uncaged side facing out. Similarly, he painted compass and skull on the back of an earlier Still Life, dated, I don't know if I have that date right, around 1931. The Still Life, however, is signed, indicating that at some point Braque thought of it as finished. Now it lives upside down as the verso of the later picture. So I'd like to wrap up with a look at the paintings of the Rosenberg Quartet, which are assembled for the first time since the early 1930s in the first gallery of the exhibition. Braque completed all four of these pictures in 1928 and 1929, and together they give us a glimpse into his practice of working on painting side by side and a sense of the different types of reworking that we found in his pictures. A photograph from 1928 shows the napkin ring, set aside unfinished, hanging on the wall of the artist's Paris studio. The entire painting is not visible, but it is possible to recognize key elements in this early version of the work. The dark background and the veins of faux marbling, the outline of the table, a picture half in shadow, and two apples, a lemon, and a napkin ring on a white tablecloth. Braque later added the grapes, the translucent rectangular tray, the glass next to the pitcher, and the white shapes at either end of the table that can be seen in the finished work. Similarity of the color scheme to some paintings of the early to mid 1920s, particularly the black ground and the green and white marbling, suggests that while important reworkings occurred in 1928 and 1929, Braque may have begun with a napkin ring as early as 1925. And when the napkin ring was photographed unfinished in 1928, Braque had already completed the first two pictures of the Rosenberg Quartet, Lemons and Napkin Ring, and Picture Lemons and Fruit Dish. As we have seen, there is some reworking in the preliminary drawing of Lemons and Napkin Ring. However, no other significant changes to the composition were discovered. In its simplicity, the painting is most like the napkin ring as we have seen it in its unfinished state. examination of pitcher lemons and fruit with transmitted light revealed that Braque made a couple of fairly significant changes to this picture. Please note that the transmitted light photograph has been flipped in the slide to match the front of the painting. So it should be one-to-one rather than a mirror image. So the transmitted light shows a round fruit resembling a peach that Braque painted and then painted out before settling on lemons. Also revealed is what appears to be the handle of a knife. Also, it sort of goes through the peach, which originally rested on the plate before Braque shifted it to the left in the painting. In addition, pentimenti at the neck and irregular texture in the body of the picture indicate this element was a later addition painted over the tablecloth and the yellow background. These changes suggest that Braque had more trouble resolving the composition of pitcher, lemons, and fruit dish, raising the possibility that he began painting before lemons and napkin ring. In our study, we also found that Braque made significant changes to the fourth painting of the set, the crystal vase, which belie the apparent simplicity of the 1929 composition. First, infrared examination revealed the painting to have more in common with the other 1929 picture, the napkin ring, than an initial comparison of the two paintings would indicate. In infrared, the outline of the napkin ring with the triple X pattern can be seen just to the right of the fruit dish. This appears to be part of the preliminary sketch and is similar to the napkin ring in the other 1929 quartet painting of the same name. You probably can't see it, but there are faint green pentimenti in this same area, barely visible under normal lighting, and hint at other overpainted elements of the composition. When the painting is viewed in ultraviolet light, clusters of dark or non-fluorescent circles correspond with areas of the green pentimenti seen in the normal light, suggesting at least 3 bunches of grapes were painted over. In removing these elements, Braque significantly simplified the composition palette of the picture and gave greater emphasis to the visual and tactile connections in the faceting of the vase, the ridges of the fruit, and the piped folds of the table. Considered individually and together, the 21 works examined in this study underscore Braque's expressed interest in the materials and process of painting. Over the course of the study, the care with which Braque executed his pictures and his attention to the details and subtleties of surface became increasingly clear. Although the tactile quality of his paint surfaces makes them inherently fragile, the remarkable condition of many of the examined paintings is a testament to the artist's expert knowledge of the craft of painting. It is my hope that our study might offer the viewer another way of approaching and appreciating Braque's work. I'd like to end with this missive from the artist himself. It expresses a remarkable thing about technical studies, that for all the questions answered by science, and the more we understand about an artist's materials and methods, what we really gain is a greater appreciation for the indefinable secrets and mysteries, and why some are considered masters of their art. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has.
The quotations by Braque, are those from the single source or from the
Most of them are from a 1954 interview. The author is Dora Vallier, and it's in Cahiers d'Art. This last quote was taken from, I think it was a 1959 publication by John Richardson. It's just called John Richardson, and I think it's just called Georges Braque.
it seemed kind of counterintuitive to me that Braque would use an opaque green on that one tablecloth and a translucent green for the wall. Any thoughts about that?
I think he chose the translucent green for the wall. It was on a black ground, and he used some of the green, pure green, and he used some of it mixed with white. And it didn't have the overpowering opacity of the other green. And so you could create that nice modulation and pattern in the background. I think that would be my guess. So,
Maybe he was thinking in terms of the need for the table itself to be obdurate, to be a stillness in the otherwise highly motivated composition.
Okay, in contrast to the pattern in the background. Yeah.
Were there ever any laboratory searches or some other mediums that you discovered?
They're outside of the scope of this, outside of the dates that we looked at. Actually, inside the dates too. There's a picture, there's a sketch for the red table. They're not always exactly the same. There's a sketch for a large interior with palette. And I haven't seen the sketchbooks, so I don't know in terms of did he do larger preparatory sketches that he then referred to. And everything that I read, so that he mostly referred to the sketchbooks. And some match more than others. And the interesting thing about the red table, if I'm remembering correctly, is there are little notations for colors. So there's brun and marron, but there's nothing specific in terms of like what I would be.
So, but there were art sketchbooks.
Mm-hmm.
And where are those located?
I think they're in the Laurent archive.
Private collection in Paris, it's fairly difficult to access. We wanted to get them for the show.
Are they published?
Some are.
Some pieces
Some
of
are, yeah. And there really aren't that many books on Braque, so I think you'll find them.
Since there were some studies about the earlier period of his career, can you make any comparisons for us about the kind of experimental nature or shifts in his working method between the teens and the period of your study?
Well, a couple of things that I found interesting were in looking at the canvas supports and the fact that he was stretching his own canvas. He was doing that in the teens. And actually, I think that that same they've seen that same scissor cut edge, and I don't know if they saw any of the pencil lines. And the other thing that was interesting was, and this is, I didn't really get into it, but in his playing with space, he stopped doing collage, like in earnest, gluing paper onto it. But he, in a way, continued doing collage because he's playing with layers of shapes that are sort of, his space is sort of kind of mushed into this narrow plane, and he's playing with the patterns as well. And when you see patterns in paintings, like the Blue Mandolin is a good example. The patterns don't really follow the form that you would expect, like in the table leg or in the tablecloth. It's more flat, like it would be and he's continuing. I think his use of some of these decorative painting techniques with the graining comb and whatnot. I think that becomes. I think he becomes more confident with it. He becomes more confident with the sand, adding sand to the layers, and he plays around with the marble a little more and the wood grain, and it's more stylized. He's not trying to make it be illusionistic.
There's a painting in the second room of the exhibition, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name, but it has a distinctive passage of cone paint, sort of wood grain background, where he's actually used the glazing techniques and transparent color of blue over top of some sections of it. Is that as unusual of a use for him as it seems to be in the work I've seen, or is it? Have you seen that in more paintings outside of this period?
I would guess they probably are outside of the period, but so that sounds like the blue mandolin too.
Maybe it is.
And if you're thinking of the wood graining in that, and it looks like glazing. And I think the thing I like about that, and that is almost one of the most illusionistic, I think, treatments that I've seen in this period. The thing I like about that is when you look at it, it's clear that he did the pattern of the wood using the brush rather than some gimmicky technique or something. It's a very traditional approach. But I was just looking at, I threw the slide out. I didn't talk about any background, but in homage to J.S. Bach, where there's a painting from 1911 that some people think is where he first introduces the graining comb. And there's a similar sort of he does wood grain with the brush and then he comes back with the comb to sort of add another layer of interest, texture.
I think when you research Braque, you hear all these incredible stories, they use sawdust, sand. Someone asked me the other day about ash. Obviously, some of the research you do actually tells you what's in these paints. Did you find anything but sand? I mean,
Well, except for the quartz.
What was the question?
She was asking if, so in various stories of Braque, you hear he's adding all kinds of things to the paint: ash, sawdust. Those were the big ones, in addition to sand. All we saw was sand. All I saw, and I think even Anshab mentions it. And so I was looking for it, especially the sawdust. And I almost convinced myself. There's a painting where it's more that he had a brittle brush and was really working the paint. So you've got little brush hairs in the paint, but I didn't see anything but sand. The sand is what, everything we looked at. It's almost like saying you could just get off the beach. It's not anything special. It's variegated, different sizes, different shapes. I think we found in the...
is it Barrelfield sand?
It might be. We found it in the pewter pot. I don't know.
He has a country home on the coast of Normandy.
We do have the analysis that the scientists did of the large feldspar particle in the round table. They did some. They found like uranium in it, or you could probably place it if you really wanted to. I was going to say in the pewter pot, the cross section we had a quartz crystal in it, but we also found feldspar particles in that too. So. But nothing that makes me, I wonder if it's because of these different surfaces. Like, I think that's why I was so interested in the two different black grounds that, at a glance looked similar, but were very different. And especially the one on the pewter pot that looks so absorbent. And so I wonder if people, or he may have just said it at one point. He's got other things.
Thinking back over a number of artists, it occurs to me that throughout history there were painters who either painted on top of the canvas, flipped it over, and you reused it, or added, or took away certain things from it. But this is the first one I've heard of that made a methodology out of that, where it almost seems that instead of conceiving of a finished piece, that it was always looked at each canvas was something to be taken to a certain point, set aside, and going back and so on. Is that the case, or is this much more prevalent than I realize? Is he the first one to make a methodology out of this, or is this? Can you think of others who have done that?
Oh, I don't know that I would know. It's a very good question.
I mean, it's engaging to me as an architect and designer, because to me, a design is never finished. You always later think, you know, if I'd only done this, or trying to go back and
actually,
noodle with it, you know.
I don't know if he had a methodology that Degas would pops to mind. He would, halfway through a picture, make a drawing, or I don't know if he did. It looked like tracings. They match so well that they're not. But you'll have paintings that have multiple drawings that go with them in different stages, and so there are definitely artists that really continue to fuss. I think over one picture, but I think Braque, I think he said he worked on like 10 paintings at a time or something, and but it might take him years in going back and forth.
There's something very attractive about that to me, that you couldn't necessarily, or wouldn't want to preconceive the whole composition, but let it evolve over time.
And it may have something to do with they're not really series, but they seem to be series of works. He doesn't label them as such. Like the Rosenberg Quartet was done all at the same time, but we don't know if he really conceived of it as a series or not. So, yeah.
That's sort of I almost feel like I'm getting deep water here, but that's almost an aspect of 20th century, modernity, that you reveal the process. So Matisse, you see it in a lot of artists. Obviously, it's particularly special in Braque. It's something that was really fascinating to us, and that we really, in this exhibition, wanted to get at, and that the focus nature of the show allows us. If you're a retrospective, you have one for every moment, but across time, that this really allows us to kind of get these things together and look at them that way. But Liz, obviously, process is always important to artists forever.
But what I'm thinking is that later things, abstract expressionists, it was something that had to be immediate and complete, more or less, to have that the vitality of movement, or the way that something was applied. This, because of the complexity of these compositions, seems to me to be much more
start out to figure the subject,
It's the
paper transfer in mind, like put it on the canvas, you have that paint, flip it over, and that.
Was that the same type of?
It's later from.
No, I'm not.
But like work on the canvas.
Tomorrow.
Well, it's just a but I find it fascinating.